I'd like to thank you all for making time to come and see the presentation here today. On behalf of the Indigenous Health Program and Alberta Health Services and the Alberta Children's Hospital, I'd like to welcome you to this presentation today. The City of Blackstock is a GitSAN member from BC. She's been working on children's rights and children's issues for the past 30 years. Publicized many articles and has a number of doctorates as well. On behalf of the Indigenous Health Program and Pablo Russell is going to be doing our opening prayer. Pablo? And for those of you online, we'll start right away.
I'm very honored to say this opening prayer for this event, and it's a topic that's close to my heart, which is children. And of course, you know, for First Nations people, you know, children are very important to us. You know, long ago we moved every 3 days so the grass could stand back up. They called us nomadic. And the reason why we moved every 3 days is so our children will have grass, you know, and everything we do environmentally is not for us. We put tobacco and we pray and we ask permission to take a plant either for medicine or for food, and we pray that two will grow in its place for the future generation. So before I do my opening prayer, I just want everybody to touch your hair. We say this is the grass on the ground. Everybody feel your bones. These are the stones, the rocks, mountains. Everybody look at your veins. They're rivers, streams, and creeks. Everybody feel your breath. How many of you need a mint? That's the wind. Everybody touch your heart. That's the middle of the earth. So we call it Mother Earth. Eh? And we have to be very cognizant of taking care of her for our children. So again, I'm very honored to say this opening prayer for this event. I'll be praying for each and every one of you here, for your loved ones at home, especially the children here that are in the hospital here. People in the streets, incarcerated, homeless. And I'll include what you do for the Creator in service of man, that you're rewarded for that. So this will be included in my prayers. Ayo na pinato siya pikimato kinanan Kristiko ekaki amaki konaksi puiskaki agit kanasuka piwakaki niakutsi puiskaki archita mutsta pichi pinanuk taksi puis piwakaki archita mikok pinus kitsi pis pinanuk to kinanistaki archita pakyots pichi pinaneni akutsi puiskaki Hogi nog gesaki nog sitjes kan sta boot de moek nan stekje mi wakaki ni puka wakaki. Hij is de bere biopak biki matos moek si da boot de kiksaki. En ik zes sapiksaki. Hij nog gesaki nog sitjes kan sta boot de moek ja dan staat iets katsia kuku so wakaki. Hogi nog het toch japs kaks benanaat se moers kan nitski manna niksaki. Kjochtika is saat se saa sotsits typeni se pomabike saako papiska napi johtukimmiska. Iska kessintskim ja stoapi kamotane nimisami päätä piisinikaki. Hoki mata sapu tonanen niksipu kawakak numitipsta ja piwakakin ja tsohkuikaki. Hen jekskin niitä kiwakakin ja swahsiita kiwakaki. Hen jinani ja niitkatsi sinikaki. Haan gapatu istumu sakit sakatu motsitsistum siistaki. Oi on juoksista sota päätsistä siiskaki. Okista päädä piopikin maatu sakin eksisitä kaapoh piiksaki. Eni matohku pia matohku ikaya. Enik siya sumyuk kaya iksak na pinatose. Ho kijidam sapu katu penanen nuis tui wakaki. Aswat ayus skoksatu penanen ni peta pis ni kakak stuiksim stanaki. Ho kikimatu kinanaki. Enis bokistawatsimaan kamutan. Heni nitknoxis katwa matabi nitknox peipuyan xichikoikaki. Thank you.
Cindy, I'd like to welcome you to Calgary, traditional Treaty 7 territory.
So it's a great honor to be here on these traditional lands, and I give thanks to our hosts. You've seen the headlines. First Nations family burns in a house fire, 10 times more likely to die in a house fire if you're a First Nations person in this country. Murdered and missing Indigenous women, more likely to go missing, more likely to be murdered, and more likely to be forgotten. First Nations children overrepresented in the province of Alberta by 30 times what non-Aboriginal children experience. You know, I grew up in the bush of northern British Columbia. Going to the reserve was going to a big city for me. I can still remember the candy at this level. But my mom taught me, she said, when people say something's complex, and let's face it, we hear that word a lot. These are complex situations. When people say that things are complex, my mom said, look for the obvious, because almost no one does. And the obvious in this country has been that the federal government consciously and deliberately chooses not to fund every public service on reserve in the same way that other Canadians receive those services. What you are seeing on your TV screens is a symptom of structural and government-based discrimination. And yet, too many caring Canadians who don't know any better are often judging these children and judging these families as if they get more, as if they get more. We have normalized racial discrimination so much against Indigenous peoples in Canada that our first challenge is not to deal with it. It's to actually see it in its first instance. We need to strip away those stereotypes, those assumptions, those judgments that stop us from asking some of the most important questions about what it means to be a human being in Canada. What does it mean to uphold human rights in Canada? And is this truly a land where justice and respect prevails for everyone? Non-Aboriginal children are experts in reconciliation, just as First Nations kids are. Because children may not be experts in medicine and law or social work or politics, but they are experts in love and fairness, and they know when something's wrong. And they know that giving one group of children less because of who they are is wrong. And one non-Aboriginal girl said to me, she said, Cindy, discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money. And these children on the screen are from one of the communities where the government doesn't think they're worth the money. These are children from Norway House Cree Nation, the same community that Jordan River Anderson came from, the founder of Jordan's Principle. And while we as individuals in this room and those watching, with our hearts and our minds and every bone about us believes that those children are worth the money, the reality is that they are not being treated as if they're worth the money. They are getting far less than every other Canadian does. And that's why we need to act in order to bring into alignment what we feel about those children to what is happening for those children. And part of it is to understand how colonization works and to strip away this sensibility, these excuses that we have that place residential schools in the rearview mirror. The story of Cheney Winjack, something so painful to watch, but we can put it in the rearview mirror safely in Canada's past because we know better now. And I'm going to take us through some history in this country. It's going to show us that time and time again, the federal government of Canada has known that it's discriminating against these children, has known about the harms at the time the harms were occurring, had solutions available to it to remedy those harms, and has chosen not to do it. And the reason I'm going to tell you that story is because government is one actor in colonialism. But there is another far important actor that we can have influence on. And that is we, the people of the period. Why is it that the public did not act out in outrage at these various times when courageous whistleblowers throughout the entire history of residential schools and even till today, why haven't we acted out as a people to demand that our government does better for these kids, including full implementation of Jordan's principle? Because until we understand that, the government will continue to perpetuate this racial discrimination against children and in other ways against Indigenous peoples. This is the earliest child welfare document I know of that exists in the country. It's dated 1895, and it is really the birth certificate of child welfare. And yet many people in child welfare, and certainly in children's services, have never seen it. It's not written by a social worker. It's not asked for by a social worker. It is a requisition for a warrant to allow for the removal of First Nations children by Duncan Campbell Scott, the longest serving bureaucrat at the Indian Affairs Department. Now, he wants to remove First Nations children for the purposes of education, which we all know in this room was not education, but also because children were not properly cared for. I want you to think about that. As children serving professionals, not properly cared for. Now, what's interesting to me when I look at this document, and I contrast it against contemporary definitions of neglect, the regulations map onto it almost perfectly, the definitions of neglect. And that is the reason why First Nations children are removed at such accelerated rates, is neglect. But let's unpack this a bit more. I worked on the front lines of child protection for 13 years myself, and I've been working in child welfare for 30 years. I still don't understand what neglect means. What this warrant does is it codifies the multi-generational harm, the structural discrimination and disadvantage against First Nations peoples, and it codifies it as a parental deficit. You are not properly caring for your children. And in fact, that's what we do today in child welfare. We will do risk assessments on families, but we don't do a risk assessment on the option we have to provide to them. The system is considered to be a better option no matter what. There's no risk assessment needed on the system. There's no risk assessment that teases out what does this family actually have control over and should be held accountable for changing, for raising healthy kids, versus what are those factors that are beyond that family's control, and what are we doing about those factors? Now, people think about residential schools as education institutions, but in fact, they were more often than not child welfare institutions. By the 1950s, the vast majority of children were placed in residential schools under the not properly cared for provision. It was the leading reason why First Nations kids were placed in care. And it embeds in this idea of not properly cared for the whole dichotomy that colonialism depends on. And that is that Western civilization and Western laws and Western programs are considered to be civilized. And First Nations programs, services, and laws are considered to be savage. We don't use those words anymore, but think how often we worry about if we transferred authority to a First Nations service provider, maybe they would make a mistake. Maybe the kids would be at risk. It unfolds in that kind of way. And yes, of course, First Nations are going to make mistakes. But for thousands of years, we have survived our own mistakes. We may not survive the mistakes made by the Western systems, right? That's where we need to unpack some of this colonialism. So this is Duncan Campbell Scott. And this is one of the whistleblowers. Remember I said we have three players in colonization. We have the government, the colonial government. We have the whistleblower. And sometimes those whistleblowers were inside a government, sometimes outside. But there are people of the period who knew what was happening was wrong. And then there are the people of the period that whistleblowers count on to rise up and do things that are right. This is one of the great health heroes in Canada. His name is Peter Henderson Bryce. Who here knows of him? Just a couple of people. He actually wrote Canada's first health code. He's the reason that across the country we have clean water to drink, except for, of course, on reserves in many cases. He also was an expert in infectious diseases. He was the first public health officer in Ontario. He was president of the American Public Health Association. And by all accounts was a widely respected physician of his time on communicable disease and public health. At the age of 51, Peter Henderson Bryce, in 1904, takes up service as the health officer for the Department of Indian Affairs. And for one of his first assignments was to go out and investigate the health of the kids in residential schools. Because as Duncan Campbell Scott himself would report, some of the teachers and principals of these schools were telling him that half of the kids were dying. He thought that couldn't be, so he's going to send out a health professional. So out goes Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce. And he finds that about 25% of the kids in the school are dying each year. 48% over 3 years. And in one school, File Hills Residential School, for every 3 children that walked in, only 1 walked out alive. He would literally walk through graveyards on the schools to go to the entrance of the school. Now, as an expert in communicable disease, particularly tuberculosis, he was well aware, of course, of it ravaging on the non-Aboriginal population as well. But as Dr. Bryce pointed out, there was more money being spent on tuberculosis treatment and prevention in the city of Ottawa than there was on the entire First Nations population all over the country. He comes back to Ottawa and he says, medical science knows just what to do, quote unquote. You ventilate the schools. You don't put sick kids in with healthy kids. You give people equitable health care. And many of these kids could be surviving. Duncan Campbell Scott looks at that. And the $10,000 to $15,000 estimated price tag of it, which is not even a lot of money back then, certainly not a lot of money now, even if we adjust it for inflation, and said it's too expensive. We can't do it. So this is where the people of the period we come in. This is the front page of the Ottawa Citizen newspaper in 1907. And as you can see, it's on the front page of the Evening Citizen. It wasn't just in Ottawa. It was actually carried in major newspapers all the way over to Victoria. The Victoria Colonist had it. And you can see the headline there, Schools Aid White Plague. Startling death rolls revealed. Somehow, Dr. Bryce's report was leaked to the media. No one actually knows in the historical record how it got there, but there is one leading suspect. He continues to advocate with inside the government to save these kids' lives. What is the government's response? People say often they ignore Dr. Bryce's report. That's not true. They absolutely knew Dr. Bryce's report. And in fact, what they did is they sent an accountant out a year later to validate Bryce's report. I think they were hoping to discount it. But even the accountant knows how to count. And found that the problem is probably worse than what Bryce is saying. So Bryce keeps on advocating inside the Indian Department. He gets his research funding cut. He's prohibited from talking at medical conferences about his research. He is denied positions for which he is eminently qualified. And he is erased from the Canadian history books. In 1922, he takes another stab at awakening us, the people of the period. He walks into this false front that's still in Ottawa. Who's been to Ottawa? A few of you have been to Ottawa. If you walk down Spark Street, right past the old post office on a corner where the memorial is this building. This is James Hope and Sons. In 1922, Bryce walks in there and he publishes this pamphlet called A National Crime, detailing all of his research and reiterating the correspondence back from the government refusing to implement the reforms. He believes that if he screams out to the public, he handed these out to free for any member of parliament, members of the clergy, members of the business community, that someone would do something to help. And there were other people of the period who knew that this was wrong. One of the leading lawyers and judges of the time said that, after reading Bryce's report, in that Canada fails to obviate the preventable causes of death, it brings itself into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter. So it's incorrect to say that people didn't know any better back then, that we're judging people of that time against today's standards. Because people of that period, of that time, using those standards, found Canada's behavior to be immoral, if not illegal. Right? Bryce was not the only one raising the alarm of residential schools. Remember I said Dr. Bryce's report is written in 1922. This is written a year later in the Christmas season of 1923. It's written by a little boy named Edward B., and as you can see, it's addressed to the parents. Now, we don't know if this letter ever made it to his parents, but what we do know from reading it is that this little boy and his friends are so hungry that they're eating cats and they're eating wheat. And he's been treated so cruelly, the only thing that he can think to do in response is, number one, not cry, not cry. And number two, he's going to strike the teacher next time she's that mean to him. It's the only thing he thinks he can do. Now, we don't know if this letter ever got to his parents, but we do know it did find its way into the hands of someone very important. Duncan Campbell Scott. He reads the letter, and then he makes the statement that 99% of the children in the schools are too fat anyway. The evidence pours in, not just to Scott, but to the whole machinery of government, from people of all walks of life, inside the schools, outside of the schools. There's reports of hunters who come across children frozen in the snow, who have run away and collapsed in the snow, not just but obviously have been beaten. And the government of Canada's response in that case was to send the kids out for survival training and do nothing about the abuse. In fact, one of the recorders, Dr. Bennett, who is an educator within the federal service, says of Scott that he's not going to send any more adverse reports to Scott because Scott does nothing about them anyway. Doesn't matter how bad things are, the government isn't going to move. Now, what happened to Scott? In 1922, when Dr. Bryce was circulating his pamphlet, A National Crime, Scott was serving as president of the Royal Society of Canada, the most distinguished academic body of the time. And he was also being recognized as a Confederate poet, which is how I first met Duncan Campbell Scott, was in high school, in my Canadian literature class. And I didn't think his poems were so hot back then. But no one mentioned his day job. I think most of us studied Duncan Campbell Scott in high school, huh? He was given the Lawrence Pierce Medal, honorary doctorates, and at the time of his retirement, the government of Canada held a huge reception for him to honor him as a loyal public servant and listed him as one of the eminent Canadians in the website on Parks Canada. You can still see him listed there for his contributions to the poetic and literary arts. So in the short term, it's very interesting, these two. I think they're very instructive. You have two non-Aboriginal people of the period, both from the same faith, in fact. They went to church just down the street from one another. both public servants, both confronted by the same issue, the unnecessary deaths of these children. One had the moral courage to stand up and demand change to make sure these kids lived, and he was punished and forgotten. The one that was a moral coward and just implemented the system was promoted, was rewarded, and was honored. And we do that in bureaucracies far too often that serve children. We punish people who are actually raising issues of concern for kids, and we reward people who are conformists in the system. And it's interesting, a big hint comes from Scott himself after retirement. He writes to his publisher, as John Malloy, the historian, writes, and you must read A National Crime written by John Malloy. That's where Bryce is, he takes his title from Bryce. It tells the story of the residential schools from the Government of Canada's own documents, not from the history of survivors. You can get it at chapters. But what's so interesting about it is Scott writes to his publisher and he says, I have never done anything courageous in my entire life. And that's the closest thing to a lament that we see from Duncan Campbell Scott. Let's flash forward a few decades. This is 1967. Of course, we're coming up against Canada's 150th birthday next July. This was the 100th birthday, 1967. This is a report prepared for the Department of Indian Affairs, and it's written by a guy named George Caldwell. He was a social worker, and he was sent out by Indian Affairs to go find out what's happening with the kids in residential schools in Saskatchewan. And as you can see, that not properly cared for provision was used with a lot of vigor. By then, 80% of the children in the schools that Caldwell studied were placed there under that provision. And Caldwell said, I don't know why all these kids are really here. Why aren't we spending more resources and energy at providing support in the families, and where alternative care is required, why aren't we supporting the Indian community to provide that care? That was written in 1967, and I was 3 years old. Had that report been implemented, there would be many fewer children in care than we have today, right? It's not as if Canada doesn't know the answers. And here's another interesting report written that same year, this time on education. It is written by a guy named Alex Sims. He's looking at Indian education in Ontario. He notes the dramatic inequalities in funding for Indian education on Ontario, the lack of cultural contact, the lack of language recognition. And he's looking back at all of the previous reports that came before him that recommended the same things. And he says, can Ontario wait for this glacial change? Let someone hazard a guess as to what year or what century significant changes in the achievement of children will be realized. This is the toxic potion of incremental equality that we have all drunk. When you have deep inequalities across every public service for First Nations children, and then governments throw a little bit of money maybe at education, and they make it sound like a lot of money because it'll be millions of dollars. But they will not tell you how much they would spend if that was a non-Aboriginal child. So they don't say, we're spending $25 million this year for First Nations kids, whereas that still falls short by about 30% if they were non-First Nations kids. They don't say that. They just put out the $25 million for non-Aboriginal kids. And so the Canadian public actually thinks that we're making progress. And then they look at First Nations who are not happy with still being discriminated against, and they wonder why they're not grateful for the money, right? It reinforces this whole system. And even when you can pierce through that, they have a backup stereotype. And many of us, including me, believe these things at some point in time. First Nations people cannot manage their money. What we need is accountability, the government says. We can't throw good money after bad. So we'll pass a First Nations Accountability Act. Now, I am the first to admit there are First Nations people who cannot manage their money well. And in fact, there's probably some committing fraud. But I live in Ottawa. So why is it when we have non-Aboriginal people committing fraud and not managing their money well, that we're not passing a non-Aboriginal Financial Accountability Act? That's racial discrimination. Here's another example. The word complex. I want us to be very critical when we use that. Of course, there's some things that are complex. But I have heard time and time again from the government, for example, it is complex getting clean drinking water out to First Nations. Now, Tioga First Nation is an hour and a half outside of Toronto. They've been on a boil water advisory for 20 years. Now, they seem to be able to snap into shape Walkerton pretty quickly. So I don't know why they haven't been able to make those same gains with Tioga. Or then they'll say things like, you know what? They're just a few people. They're living in a far-flung part of the country. They can't expect to get the same services as everybody else. But somehow, they celebrate one citizen in a space station who not only has clean drinking water to drink, has a Twitter feed and a video link to everyone down here in Canada. That was not complex. When we hear the word remote, governments often only use that with people as an excuse. You will not hear governments say that uranium, for example, is too remote. They will build land in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in order to extract resources from it. Now, they, of course, work with private corporations, but they're the ones putting in the airstrips in northern far-flung places. They're the ones putting up the Wi-Fi systems. So why can't we do that with the most precious resources, which is kids, right? We just need to have more of a critical thought. Ask questions, not just assume these things are correct. Now, this isn't the end of the parade of reports where Canada had opportunities to do the right thing for First Nations kids. November 21st was the 20th anniversary of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that set out a pathway away from the Indian Act, which, by the way, is the only race-based legislation in a Western industrialized world. And you need to think about the status cards. With the very word that we use, status cards. Like, I'm super elite with Air Canada, which means I have no life. But people think the status card is the equivalent to a perks card, huh? They don't realize that the government of Canada is measuring people's blood quantum to determine whether or not they're First Nations or not, right? We've taken what is clearly a racist thing and made it into something benevolent so that it just slips off our tongue. So this was to get rid of that. And they looked at by then we have First Nations agencies. Because of the mass removals during the 60s scoop, First Nations agencies are now operating on reserve, but they have to do so according to provincial statutes because the federal government requires that. You can't use your own law. And then federal funding, which is far less than what everybody else gets. And even back in 1996, they knew that. And look at the recommendations. Don't they sound a lot like Caldwell's? That came 32 years before that? In the year 2000, I, along with many other First Nations people all over Canada, were invited to a table with the Department of Indian Affairs to chronicle the shortfalls in child and family service funding. That's that report in 2000. 17 recommendations for reform, including addressing the inequalities, providing culturally-based services, and getting rid of this jurisdictional nightmare that so often denied First Nations kids services available to all other Canadian kids. The minister sends us a letter thanking us for this high-quality report, saying he's going to review it, and then doesn't implement it. They say what's needed is another report, more detailed report. So we do the Wande study in 2005. It includes 20 top researchers and First Nations people from all over Canada. We find the shortfall then. In 2000, we found First Nations kids were getting 78 cents on the dollar. By 2005, that had grown to 70 cents on the dollar. So they were getting roughly a third less than every other kid, despite the higher needs. And the government admitted those deficits in funding were driving kids into care because you had no services to keep families together. We costed it out. We had 5 economists on this study. We have 155 pages of spreadsheets showing where every dime would go. Canada sends us another letter congratulating us on the high quality work and saying, guess what, we're going to study it. And then they don't implement it, right? So that's where we need to step back when we see Canada wanting to study. And this is where we need to step back when we see government officials say, we can't change things overnight. Now, I'm patient, but 149 years is long enough to wait. Right? This isn't something that just snuck up on government. They've known it for years and years and years and years. And the problem with incremental equality is, first of all, it never comes. Remember that report in 1967? Imagine me at 3 years old. I'm 52 now, and we're still at it. The second thing is, children do not have incremental childhoods. Think of how many children we have sentenced to recover from their childhood because we failed to act. We, the people of the period, failed to press government enough so that they were compelled to act. This is Sheila Fraser, the Auditor General of Canada. I'm sure, I think considered by many Canadians as one of the most credible Auditor Generals we've had. She did some, I think, I might be wrong with the number, but I'm going to ballpark it. I think there's 18 studies she did on various First Nations services, and across the board, she found all of them to be underfunded. And this is her closing statement that she makes as she's leaving the post of Auditor General. Her profound disappointment at all these reports she did documenting the inequalities. The government always invariably agreed with the recommendations and then failed to implement them. So that brings us to the tribunal and to Jordan's principle, which were the top calls to action in the TRC report, by the way. My organization, the Caring Society, is the only national nonprofit organization speaking specifically for First Nations kids. And when we were created, we had great advice from an elder in Northern Ontario, and I pass it along to you because I think it's really critical. I think it's something Bryce would have embraced. He said, never fall in love with the Caring Society, and never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the kids, because there may come a time when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And for us at the Caring Society, that came in 2007. Government wanted to do, guess what? Another study. But we realized while we sat at that table, the number of First Nations kids going into care had increased 71.5%. The number overall of First Nations children in child welfare care was 3 times that of residential schools. Waiting had its consequences, just not for those of us sitting around that table. So we, along with the Assembly of First Nations, filed this case against Canada. We allege that the federal government's conscious underfunding of child welfare and its failure to ensure that First Nations children can access all other public services on the same terms as other children via Jordan's principle is racial discrimination against 163,000 kids. When we filed the case, almost nobody was there. Think about that for a minute. What possibly could be more headline grabbing than the federal government being alleged to racially discriminate against 163,000 kids? Think how upset Canadian media is at the potential of Trump. But this is something he would probably do. And yet we're allowing the headlines to pass very quickly on this, aren't we? But I believe, like Bryce, that if caring Canadians knew what was happening, you would rise up against it. And I didn't need to ask you to just believe me because I'm saying so. I wanted you to see both sides of this question and make up your own minds. So that's where the I Am a Witness website comes in. It has all of Canada's documents, all of our documents, and we don't ask you to take a side, we simply ask you to watch. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is sign up to be a witness. Now, the case goes on for 9 years. Canada tries to get it kicked out on legal technicalities, never once arguing that its position was in the best interest of children. It spent over $10 million in legal fees trying to get it kicked out on that basis. But thankfully, it was unsuccessful. I should also say that within 30 days of our filing that case, we lost all of our government funding. We are the only national organization that has zero funding from any level of government. But I really believe that there comes a time when you've got to stand up for kids, right? That's our job as adults, to stand up for kids. Finally, we get to the tribunal, and here's some of the evidence. We talk about overrepresentation, and I think most of us in this room can say it without wincing. And that's what makes that word so dangerous. So you can say that you're 15 times more likely to be in foster care for First Nations, or 30 times more likely in Alberta, and we can say that without wincing. I can say it without wincing. But this document didn't allow me to do it, because it didn't think of overrepresentation that way, didn't count it that way. It counted up in a way that children themselves would count it. How many sleeps till I see my mom? And when you added up all the nights that First Nations kids, on reserve only this is, and in the Yukon Territory, spent in care between 1989 and 2012, it's over 66 million nights, or 167,000 years of childhood. That's the price of waiting. That's the price of being patient with the government, is that number increases by 10,000 every night. And what about Jordan's principle? This is Jordan River Anderson. He comes from the community, the same community those beautiful kids at the front did, the front slide. He had complex medical needs. He had to stay in Winnipeg Children's Hospital for 2 years, medically required. But shortly after his second birthday, there was a plan in place. He would have been discharged to a family home, and then life would have continued for Jordan. But Jordan was a First Nations child. And everyone agrees, including the federal government, if he was non-Aboriginal, he would have gone home that day. But because he's First Nations, Canada, Indian Affairs, Health Canada, and the province of Manitoba argued over who should pay. The end result is they left him in hospital for over 2.5 years while they argued over who should pay. His physicians were writing to the government saying, stop this nonsense, let this kid go home. But they were in many ways like Dr. Bryce. They were screaming into silence. The bureaucrats would write back and say, we have another meeting next week. We'll get this all sorted out. We're doing the best we can. But poor Jordan, his sister says, died of a broken heart. Just after his 5th birthday, he slips into a coma and he dies in that hospital, never having spent a day in a family home. So it's important for you to know that Jordan's principle was created by Jordan's family, because they didn't want any other child to go through it. So what does it say? It says First Nations children should be able to access all government services the same way other kids should. There shouldn't be more red tape or denials or disruptions or delays in service because they're a First Nations child. Just makes sense, right? It passes unanimously through the House of Commons. And then Canada, behind the scenes, creates a definition so narrow, no child ever qualifies. No child ever qualifies. And this is one of the reports of the Assembly of First Nations. You can look at it online if you want. But I just wanted to show you this graph. So at the bottom is a normal queue for services for every other kid, right? So your child gets assessed. It could be from an educator or additional help at school. It could be by a medical practitioner. It could be by a social worker. And they say this is what you need. And then you get in a queue like everybody else, and you wait on the wait list, and you make your way through that, and then you get the service. But all those extra steps in gray are what a First Nations child has to go through, on top of that yellow. And imagine yourself if you're a First Nations survivor residential school where you got a grade 3 education, trying to navigate all of this, right? So it's no wonder they could publicly say there were no cases. And yet their own internal records behind the scenes said, yes, there are in fact cases. We had that Indian Affairs documents which show kids being denied life-saving medical treatment because they said it didn't meet their narrow definition of Jordan's principle. The federal court in 2013 found their definition of Jordan's principle to be unlawful, but the government didn't change it. So the tribunal comes to a ruling. January 26, 2016. It finds that Canada is racially discriminating against 163,000 children by consciously providing fewer services in child welfare. The tribunal recounts many of the reports that we just saw, the multiple reports where Canada chose not to implement the findings. The tribunal says that this ongoing discrimination is widening the gap of residential schools, not narrowing it. And they also made a comment on the Government of Canada's position. They said overall they found their position to be unreasonable, unconvincing, and not supported by the preponderance of evidence. They say that there's clear evidence that Canada's way of funding child welfare services is, in the words of the tribunal, incentivizing children going into care. They order immediately, I don't want you to take that word in, immediately, the government to stop. This is a legal order. This isn't a recommendation. This is a legal order under Canadian law. So I breathed a sigh of relief. After all, this was the government who said they would implement all the TRC actions. This is the government who said nation to nation is their most important relationship. But I also said that day I wanted to see it at a level of kids, because that's where we need to measure success, not in what politicians say. So they do nothing for 3 months. And then they come out and they release Budget 2016. Now, they say it's a historic budget. They say it's $6.84 million. What they don't do is tell you, really emphasize that it's spread over 5 years. And that the vast majority of the money does not come until the year of the next election or the year after the election, which assumes they get back in, right? So there's actually very little coming to First Nations kids today. I estimated the shortfall to be about $216 million. That's not the depth of it. That's just taking some of the immediate heat off. And that's not funding for Jordan's principal cases. That's just getting some relief out there to agencies so they can service families on prevention. The government's own document under the Conservative government found the shortfall to be $108 million in 2012. And in evidence, that's shown to be a significant shortfall. So this is our own PowerPoint estimate. They released $71 million for this year, of which they take $10 million for themselves, meaning only $61 million goes to kids. So that's less than a third of what is actually needed immediately to address the harm. It turns out in evidence, I saw this budget and I thought, this looks suspicious to me. Something about this did not feel right. And on September 30th of this year, in legal submissions before the tribunal, the government finally admitted this was not a response to the tribunal ruling at all, Budget 2016, because they had written it months before the tribunal even ruled. This was written 4 months before the tribunal ever handed down its decision. So what they did is they took the decision and tried to ram it into what they had already decided, instead of stepping back and saying, how do we come into compliance with the law? Here is what the tribunal found on Jordan's principle. They ordered to immediately implement the full meaning of Jordan's principle across all jurisdictional disputes. The government of first contact, that meaning Indian Affairs, has to pay. There can't be any more case conferencing before the child gets a service. It applies to all First Nations children, on and off reserve. On and off reserve. These are legal orders. Canada chose not to appeal them. That makes it Canadian law. This is the law. It's not a matter of opinion, it's the law in Canada now. So let's take the big pieces of the tribunal order. So the tribunal orders it to apply Jordan's principle on and off reserve, and that would include health services. The child received the service without any delay, that it applies to all jurisdictional disputes, even if they're between the federal government or doesn't matter what government. If it's really about putting kids ahead of red tape. What does Canada do? They say, no, it doesn't apply to all First Nations kids. The only First Nations kids who are eligible for equitable services have a short-term illness or a disability. Now, how does that make any sense? Why is it all other children are able to access any equitable service just because they're a child, but First Nations kids have to have a short-term illness or a disability. Let's just show the obvious problem with this. What about kids with long-term illnesses? Kid with diabetes, cancer. Aren't they entitled to equitable access to services? The tribunal issues 2 further compliance orders against the federal government, unsatisfied with their progress. And they are fighting against this teenager from Sucker Creek First Nation. This is Kennedy. This is what the discrimination looks like on the ground. She was assessed by medical professionals here in Alberta as requiring $8,000 of treatment so that she could eat and talk without chronic pain. She was denied on 3rd level appeal by First Nations Inuit Health Branch the day before the tribunal issued its order. So we bring this case to the attention of the federal officials and say, here's a chance to do the right thing. They agree to reassess the case, and then they deny her again. Now keep in mind that her the original cost of her necessary treatment is about $8,000. Pursuant to access to information, we've now found that the federal government has spent over $32,000 in legal fees fighting this teenager in court. So that's happening right now. So the Prime Minister is making a statement about human rights. I think this is actually when China was visiting. And remember all the worrisome things about China's human rights record. And a reporter for the Canadian Press brings these non-compliance orders to the Prime Minister's attention. And his first response is, well, we're doing all these historical investments for Indigenous people, including $71 million for child welfare. And then the reporter asks a very important question that I think we need to do as children professionals. And what she said is, she said, Mr. Prime Minister, if budget 2016 is not good enough for the tribunal, then why is it good enough for you? And that's his response about doing better. But that still makes me worried because it sounds permissive, right? These are legal orders. These aren't recommendations. We have a government that's racially discriminated against 163,000 kids. If I was found to have been discriminating against even one kid, my first response wouldn't be to talk about all the good things I did for that kid. It would be to be really reflective about the harm that I did, trying to learn what that harm is so I don't do it again, and immediately try to make up for what I did, right? So we need to, and this isn't because he's a bad guy, but this is just this is how colonialism looks today. So there's no compliance, so the NDP pass a motion in the House of Commons. They say, hey, we want full compliance. We have to have a parliamentary motion on November 1st to try and get the government to comply with the law on children, ending discrimination against kids, right? I remember I was before the Finance Committee, and of course, some of the members said, well, you know, we can't fund everything. And I said, well, I understand that. I said, I'm a taxpayer. I understand that. I said, but are we so broke? Like, what are the First Nations kids losing to? Why do we have to racially discriminate against them? What things come further up the priority line, right? And what we saw from the National Post is they had spent $7 billion over the summer on tennis courts and flagpoles. So First Nations kids come after tennis courts and flagpoles. So the NDP puts this motion to the House. The Liberal Party originally argues against it in a lot of ways. They question this number. They say they're actually in compliance with Jordan's principle, that they're doing all these good things. We don't need the motion. But then Justice Sinclair from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission comes out with a public letter saying, urging them all to vote for it. So they vote for it. And one of the key pieces applies to Kennedy's case. Remember, see, Stop Fighting Families in Court? This was a Wednesday. On Friday, the government is back in court fighting that teenager on cross-examination. They've not done anything to implement the motion. Now, this whole case has been documented in a National Film Board documentary that I think is really important for people to watch. It's called We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice. And it takes you inside the courtroom so you can listen to the bureaucrats and you can see us testifying, including people from Alberta, and just make up your own mind. It makes it real, right? Now, what about this long arc to history? Like, what is the hope in all of this? Well, remember I told you that Duncan Campbell Scott was remembered very well in the history books for many years. Well, this is Beechwood Cemetery. And on the day, I actually received the decision on the child welfare case several days before the world knew. And when I saw the decision, I knew immediately I had to do something. You see, Dr. Bryce is buried in Beechwood Cemetery. And so I got on my winter boots and I walked in a lone track of footsteps down to his burial place. And I dusted the snow off of his headstone. And I read him the decision. And I said, "Justice, Dr. Bryce, justice." And as I looked back, I saw that one step of footprints, my own footprints, but I knew they weren't just mine. They were the many people throughout the period who had tried to raise the alarm to do the right thing for these kids, including little Edward B. Well, Dr. Bryce didn't have a historical plaque beside his grave because history had forgotten him. So we decided to put one there to recognize this man. But Duncan Campbell Scott is also buried there. And he too had a historical plaque talking about all the things that I learned about in high school Canadian literature. And I walked past that and I thought, this one needs a revision. So this is us at Duncan Campbell Scott's grave. That is his new historical plaque that has the words cultural genocide and Confederate poet in the same paragraph. So it's a reminder that your obituary is not written by your friends and family. I mean, haven't you ever wondered where all the bad people are in the obituary section? I've told my family, I said, I don't want one of those. I want the real deal. Has way too many coats, all the rest of this stuff, impatient, all the rest of this stuff. Not some kind of glossed over crazy version. And something else too. The office building where Duncan Campbell Scott and the Indian Affairs Department administered the residential school program still exists in Ottawa. It's just down the street from Spark Street. It's called the Booth Building. And Duncan Campbell Scott would have worked on the 5th floor there. Now, I can't imagine what Duncan Campbell Scott would have thought of the new tenants of this building that moved in several decades after he moved in. That was the first Ottawa Bureau of the Aboriginal People's Television Network. So, justice does come, but not just by a legal decision. It's going to take caring healthcare professionals and community members and service workers like yourselves to operate on Jordan's principle as the tribunal has ordered it. If you have a Jordan's principle case, if you know of any First Nations child that's being denied any public service normally available to other kids because they're First Nations, you need to be immediately reporting that to Indian and Northern Affairs. It is their job to pay immediately. That's what the law requires. It is not your job to chase around to all the other federal departments. That's the Indian Affairs job, according to the decision. And if they are not implementing the order, you need to let us know so that we can hold their feet to the fire to implement the order. I've always said I'm not against the government. I'm against racial discrimination against children. And all of us need to be against that too if we want to make it stop, right? One final thing. You know, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to thank for its good work on telling the stories of residential schools, to be able to instruct us on how similar the behaviors are we're seeing today. That we, the people of the period, are still not sufficiently outraged to keep racial discrimination and legal violations of orders on the front pages of newspapers and broadcasters. But we can change all of that with the power of history. But there hasn't been as much focus on the non-Indigenous side. And I think this program by the Australian broadcaster helps us better understand this. And this is not to shame people. I need to say, when you hear these stories as non-Indigenous people, I don't want you to feel ashamed. That does nothing for us. I want you to feel empowered as co-creators of creating a different future. But this video helps us unpack some of those views that you're going to confront in your workspaces about people who have not learned about this history, who continue to have these misconceptions. So I think this is a really useful video. So let's just quickly watch it. It's just a trailer.
Is there a time limit on getting over your race being wiped out? How many hundreds of years is it supposed to be that you're just meant to just get up and get over it? I don't think it's for us to speak on.
You've got to get off the grog. And I know that because I'm a pisshead. And I've stopped drinking for this show because I feel as a mark of respect, that's the right thing to do. And trust me, if I can do it, anyone can do it.
If pushed, I would have to say I have had racist thoughts about Aboriginal people. I don't hate them. I don't love them. But maybe I don't care or think enough about them.
When it comes to the stolen generation, if you look at it and you consider the danger that many of those children were in, you might consider them the rescued generation. Had they not been removed, they wouldn't have survived into adulthood to then complain about having been stolen.
It's pretty convenient that everyone who wants people to get over our bad history aren't descended from the victims of that history. So it's weird how it's sort of white, rich, privileged men who want to tell us that we need to get over it.
I know a lot of Aboriginal people believe they're owed something, but I just feel like everyone should be treated equally. They kind of need to forgive whatever they think has happened and move on and just try and just be equal with everyone.
In the next 28 days, you'll get a sense of what it's like to be an Aboriginal Australian. Just a crash course, if you like. But it's not going to be easy, let me tell you. There are times you will see things and hear things that'll probably shock you, maybe even appall you. Are you ready for that?
That's the conversation that Justice Sinclair is inviting us to take. As he said, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And so that's kind of our joint challenge, is to become pissed off. To become pissed off that in 2016, the government is continuing to racially discriminate against kids, when it can and must do better. Equality for children should not come in a shuffle. It needs to come in a leap, in the same way that childhood happens. Same way that childhood happens. All of you are part of the solution of creating a different Canada. My dream for Canada's 150th birthday is simple. I want to help raise a generation of First Nations children that never have to recover from their childhoods, and a generation of non-Aboriginal children who never have to say they're sorry. But it's going to take all of us, the people of this period, to make that happen. Thank you very much.
We will open it up for probably 10 minutes for questions. Anybody in the room?
I will say about one of the major things we need to get over is you have to ask yourself just bluntly, do you agree with racial discrimination as a sorting mechanism, as a triage mechanism for public services? Do you agree with that or not? If you don't agree with it, then there's no way to rationalize the ongoing discrimination First Nations kids face. If you do agree with it, you will always find ways of rationalizing it. Just like this guy. And as you can see, he is a perfect timing because we all know, no matter how much we spend on him today, not only is it the right thing to do because he's such a sacred person. Hey there! I've never had anyone fight to get into one of my talks before. But because it's the economically the sound thing to do. When we talk about how big that gap is, that's how much money Canada saved by racially discriminating against kids. And we have to say, how comfortable are we seeing that continue? That really is the blunt end of the instrument, right? So.
Well, if there are no questions.
All right. Well, I've got a date with Air Canada. Yeah? Yes, we've got one.
I'm from Winnipeg, and the Human Rights Museum was recently built there. And I know that there was several concerning things that came out of it in terms of the Aboriginal population. I was just wondering what you thought about what had been done to discuss the atrocities that have been committed to our Aboriginal population within that museum, and if you think it was enough.
Just personally, I really see an important role for museums like that to draw for those historical lessons into a contemporary place of learning so that it's instructive to people today. I think the temptation, at least for me in the exhibits as I was walking through, is I saw a lot of video screens. And I can watch YouTube videos at home. But when I saw the red dress of a African-Canadian girl who was not able to go to prom because she was African-Canadian, that's the stuff that changes you inside. I have Jordan River Anderson's baby blanket in my office. Every time I walk by that, I remember what the responsibility he left to all of us. That's the kind of thing I'd like to see more of in the museum. And providing people with ways to get involved. What I try to do at the Caring Society is, because there are many caring Canadians don't know about this or have never thought about it this way. And then they do want to do something to help. But in the past, people like me would get up and we would give you broad, sweeping things and you wouldn't know what to do. So we have 7 free ways to make a difference in under 2 minutes. Cost absolutely nothing. I say to Canadians, I don't want to build a relationship with your wallet like many nonprofits do. I want to build a relationship with you as co-creators of a better Canada together. And one that values non-Aboriginal children too. It's not about standing up for just First Nations kids. It's about standing up for the rights of all children and doing that in a way that uplifts society. So I'd like to see the human rights movement move in that museum, move in that direction where you actually come out with things that you can do to create, to create a more peaceful and respectful world, especially now in the times we live in. It is a very dangerous place for human rights around the world right now. Yes?
I think for us, like I'm Georgina, and I actually do some presentations for new social workers. And one of the things that I actually try to do is I try to stay on the positive. Just like you say, sometimes we talk about a bit of the history. You always have to give a bit of the history, where we are today and where we will be going. So my message is usually always about, it's the same as yours, like what can we do? What are we doing? And one of the things that I try to talk about is the discrepancies. Like sometimes people have this astute thing that we get these millions of dollars that are put out for Native people, but they never talk about what's taken from the reserves from the oil and stuff like this. But also it's about, they don't talk about what Canadians get. And I know if you ever see Wab Canoe and some of his videos and stuff, they're really important. And I really think that's important for all of us, is to give that image out. We are surviving because we survive because of who we are. Because we actually didn't fall into that self-pity thing, but there is a lot of that still. But at the same time, it's about how we survive. It's about our humor. It's about what we do and where we're all going. Like at one time, education was the worst thing for the Indian. Today, the education is the best thing. So I grasp little things from every time I hear people. And so I think that's a good way to actually promote what's happening within the Aboriginal world. But also, I really like what you said about, it's not just about the Aboriginal people, it's about our children. And that's actually always my message. It's about children, because they're the most important. They're the grassroots of what's coming in the next generation, and that's where we need to be at.
And we have something called Have a Heart Day. Because children really have taught us that they're the best ambassadors for reconciliation. They get this stuff. Their parents don't get it because sometimes parents don't get a lot of obvious things, but kids get this. And so what we do is we engage children in something called Have a Heart Day, and you can do it here at the hospital too. Do it with the children that come to the hospital or visit the hospital. And what we do is we ask kids to make a Valentine's Day card, so that First Nations kids can grow up safely in their families, get a good education, be healthy and proud of who they are. Now they can draw a picture, they can write a message, they can do whatever, and you can send that to the Prime Minister. And you don't even need a stamp. Canada Post will deliver that free of charge. So every child, no matter what their family income is, can participate in this. And it's done with such love, right? Like, so children will write letters to the Prime Minister. I remember one non-Aboriginal special needs boy who was one of those kids who thought no one ever wanted to hear what he said, right? And finally his teacher convinced him to get his Valentine out of the garbage can because he had thrown it in there 4 times because no one wanted to hear him. And to present it at Parliament Hill with a microphone. So this kid gets up there and he says, "Dear Prime Minister Harper, my name is Harry. Do you have a cat?" He says, "I have a cat. His name is Micah, because I like rocks. And he's a boy and he's black." And then he gets right down to business. It is better than most of the PhD dissertations I've ever had to review. Shorter, succinct, and more backed by evidence. He says, "Prime Minister Harper, listen to me. If you do not build more schools on reserves, you're going to create a crime wave and lose all of your money. Because kids on reserves who cannot get an education can't get jobs when they're bigger. But they're still going to need money to survive. So some of them are going to have to steal it. And then people in the communities, they're going to get mad because crooks are invading their homes. Now, my teacher told me you're in charge. So you better man up right now and build more schools. Love, Harry." Right? So you can engage children in an empowering way. And what I've said to folks is, you know, I've had to spend a lot of my time with First Nations children, young people, teaching them they're discriminated against by the federal government, that they're getting less. And that sounds harsh. But the other alternative is that they internalize it. They start to feel like they're not worth the money. They see other kids succeeding where they're not getting that same opportunity, and they think it's because they're not smart enough. They're not good enough. And that contributes to the high rates of youth suicide. So this gives those kids, as well as non-Aboriginal kids, loving, respectful, and peaceful ways to use their voice, to stand up not only against discrimination against First Nations people, but I tell these children, use these same skills if you see someone else not being treated properly in the world. Or if you want to stand up for heritage buildings or for different languages, this is the same thing you do. You write to the people who can make change. So I'm hoping that Alberta Health Services will do 2 things. As a hospital, write to the government and say how important it is that they comply with these decisions as healthcare professionals. Number 2, that you get on and you sign up for these campaigns. And number 3, I want to come here on Valentine's Day and see all kinds of glitter.
Well, I'm going to say a closing prayer here. When we started, we asked the Creator for blessing, for people to understand what was presented here. And sometimes when you leave a session, you're tired, and we forget the law. The spiritual law. We invite the spirits, we have to invite them home at the same time, and in that way we don't get so tired. So I'm going to do that, and I'll sing a song that comes from my country, Chief Mountain area. I come from the same place as Bonnie comes from. And, you know, I really learned a lot today, and it really makes me think a lot about, you know, what we can do, right? And some of you have children. They copy us. They copy what we do, right? So if you want change, I guess it starts with you first, and educating your children on things that that will stop things like this down the road, you know. Not too many people were educated about boarding school, and now everybody knows what it's about, you know. So education, knowing about something really makes us change. And to put yourself in their shoes and see how would it feel if my child was taken away at 5, and if I tried to do something, they would put me in jail. And then you would understand what First Nations parents went through. And then maybe it will give you a little empathy as to why a lot of First Nations parents today lack parenting skills. Because they grew up in boarding school. They didn't have mums and dads to copy, healthy role models. And so it's really important to understand these things. And like what Cindy said, to do what we can to help out, to make things a lot better. So I'm really glad that these things are happening today, because when I was younger, none of this was happening. None of this exposure, none of these kind of things were mentioned. And today, I'm very happy that it is coming out like this. So I'm going to do a closing prayer and a song to send the grandfathers home. And just want to encourage everybody to ask your own spirit to go home, especially Cindy, if you're going on a flight, not to leave him here, but to go with him, her, I should say, to protect you on your journey. Eyes the bad up your back, chiton honan, eat guys, benan, chitum canapsic guys, benan no go and nanistak, chitamatuta, chimananitski mananixak. Ogi chiktaxik maaki, quanak, Anisipsakinan and Kistikoyakak. Ach, Chikokpi, Noxkichippi, Ukaki, Nochtokinan, Ach, the backyards the pizzi, Pinan, any Tanistok, Quiz, Pinanitita Pixak. Ogimukinapi, Quaxakitus the Pita Kishka. Ach, it's Hokto Makin, no Makakax Chimaxak. Ach, it's Sukapi, Muxipukaxak. Ixtapaxipata Pixak, Chita Mistoa Siska, Suxistoa Siska. Kanasuka pikamuta pinstua pinstay pata pisanikak henikak oxiskatup matapinit knoch pepuyak. Hele hi la la hey 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 hi la la hey hey ay ay ha la hey ay ay ha la la hey ay yo hey hi la la hey ay yo hey ay ay ha la la hey ay yo hey ay ay ha la hey ay ay hi la la hey ay yo yele hi la la hey ay yo hey ay ay hi la la hey ay yo hey ay ay ha la hey ay ay hi la la hey ay yo hele hi la la hey ay yo hey ay ay hi la la hey ay yo hey ay ay ha la hey ay ay hi la la hey ay yo. So that's for everybody in here, and just to remind you not to give up on yourself or your faith. Those things will get you going, and not to forget Creator. Sometimes we forget Creator. And if we incorporate spirituality in our life, then love and compassion and understanding, forgiveness grows. So with that, I just wanted to give Cindy a present on behalf of our community. Thank you. And have a safe trip home, everybody. Thank you.